And welcome to the forum address this afternoon. My name is Frank Jotzer. I'm the director of the Center for Climate Economics and Policy that we will be launching later on this afternoon, followed by drinks. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Ross Garnaut. Ross is a distinguished professor at the ANU. He is a Vice Chancellor's Fellow and Professor of Economics at the University of Melbourne. Some of the highlights in Ross's long career include a senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Hawke, ambassador to China, both in the 80s, and then of course very recently Ross's review, the Garnaut Climate Change Review. Ross is getting to update his review. He has been asked by government to do so, and Ross is of course also one of the expert members on the multi-party committee on climate change. Ross, over to you for about half an hour, and afterwards we'll have time for questions.
Thanks, Frank. Very good to be here. And congratulations to Frank, Stephen, Peter for bringing this productive group together. In the last session, just before lunch, we were starting to feel around the edges of the question of why international cooperation, why an international agreement is actually necessary. Someone whose professional life was preoccupied for quite a long time with trade policy questions, it's a good question because we all know that if countries just get on with the job and remove their own barriers to trade, that people will be richer, much more richer even than we economists used to say it would be the case. But once you get countries negotiating on reduction of trade barriers, suddenly everyone starts hoarding the protection they already have, and they're thought of as heroes if they give the least possible bit away. And so you find you actually get less trade liberalisation when you get formal negotiations and you try to get an international agreement than if countries just get on with the job. The challenging question was put to Matsuyoshis just before lunch. Well, why bother with an international agreement? Why not just have? Well, the question was first Korea and China, and then Japan was brought in. Why not have them just getting on with the job? And I presume the rest of the story is developing the new technologies that we all use, and things will happen. Well, unfortunately, I think we will not get far enough through unilateral action. This is an issue in which there are limits to how far you'll get through unilateral action, because effective climate change mitigation is going to require strong efforts from all substantial economies, and yet each economy from a narrowly national viewpoint is likely to be better off economically if it contributes less rather than more to an effective global effort. The incentives to unilateral action are mostly negative, which makes this a harder problem than trade policy. This is the central reason why I described climate change mitigation as a diabolical policy problem, a term that Martin Parkinson reminded us of this morning. Climate change mitigation embodies the prisoner's dilemma of games theory. The formal theory suggests that communication leading to agreement on the division of benefits from cooperation is essential for an optimal outcome. What in this case is required is agreement amongst all substantial economies on the contribution that each will make to the reduction of emissions, and also on the contribution that each will make to side payments to induce some developing countries to contribute more than they would otherwise be willing to do. I should quickly add a caution about pushing the formal logic of the prisoner's dilemma too far. All countries have a strong interest in effective global mitigation of climate change, and the action or inaction of one affects the policies of others. And this affects the calculus of costs and benefits of early action. It happens that Australia has the strongest interest in effective action amongst all developed countries, so these considerations are especially relevant in this country. For all but the largest economies, national mitigation is important to the extent that it influences the behaviour of others. In some areas of international affairs, it is common to volunteer contributions to the collective good without calculations of whether the benefits of others' action could be secured even if the home country made no or minimal contribution. If the objective is recognised as being good, a small country will not usually seek to shirk all participation on grounds that it benefits more from a narrowly national point of view if it free rides on others. In the debate on Afghanistan in the House of Representatives last week, some voices argued that the United Nations continuation of the war did not serve a good purpose. None argued that the cause was good, but that Australia could receive the benefits of the war without the costs if it withdrew and rode free on the efforts of others. We're used to thinking of international relations in this way, so that it's not altogether surprising that Australians' instincts move us towards doing our proportionate part in an international effort, even if it might cost us less if we did nothing. Nevertheless, there is no challenge in international relations with a higher degree of difficulty than the mitigation of the effects of climate change. The international community has been crashing on other issues with much lower degrees of difficulty. There's been a recent tendency for supporters of effective global action to argue away the prisoner's dilemma completely, to note that there are economic gains to countries which move first, and by implication alone, in reducing emissions, which justify such action. There are some economic benefits in moving first and alone in some circumstances, but there are likely to be net benefits only in a particular set of circumstances. Net benefit from acting before there is widespread international action require an expectation that at least some major economies will be undertaking strong mitigation. In these circumstances, it is reasonable to presume that there will be pressures for others to conform, so that latecomers carry excessive costs from having to undertake structural change more rapidly, or face discrimination in international trade, or else the early movement of others captures most of the first mover advantages in producing goods and services embodying low emissions technologies. Such possible benefits from early actions have to be weighed against the direct costs. At the moment, others have moved far enough readily to justify a substantial effort on Australia's part. Enough of the logic of the prisoner's dilemma survives to make explicit agreements on cooperation an important element in effective global action to achieve strong mitigation objectives. The resolution of the prisoner's dilemma to allow an optimally large mitigation outcome remains the central task of an international agreement. Chapters 7, 8 and 9 of my review define the essential elements of an effective international agreement. There has to be agreement on three things. The first is the mitigation objective, agreement on which defines the total amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that could be emitted into the atmosphere over a specified period of time. An emissions budget, the centrepiece of Matsuyoshis' plan. The review suggests that it is in Australia's national interest to seek an objective of emissions concentrations in the atmosphere of 450 parts per million or lower, roughly equivalent to having a reasonable chance of holding average temperature increases to about 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The review discusses a time path for slowing emissions growth that is consistent with the budget. The second is a set of principles for allocating the derived emissions budget amongst countries, an arrangement for monitoring and enforcing compliance. The second step wasn't in Matsuyoshis' plan. The allocation principles need to be seen as being fair by all countries that are required to be part of an international agreement. The unambiguous allocation across countries of the budget of greenhouse gas emissions removes the market failure associated with the external costs of emissions-intensive economic activity. The review takes the view that no agreement on the allocations is likely unless it is based on eventual convergence towards equal per capita entitlements, and Professor Pan Jiahua emphasised that point in his presentation this morning. The third is required to remove the market failure associated with externalities in research, development and commercialisation of new low emissions technologies. The review notes the importance of some other elements of international agreement that are in the nature of side payments to encourage participation of developing countries. There are some additional requirements of an international agreement that minimises the economic cost of achieving a specified mitigation objective. Wide international differences in the cost of reducing emissions across countries mean that the cost of mitigation will be substantially lower if there were open international trade in entitlements. Participation in international trade can also greatly increase incentives for lower income countries and developing countries to embark upon strong mitigation. That's a message that always comes out in discussions with the Indonesian cabinet. Rules for trade are therefore important subsidiary elements in an international agreement. Ideally, most substantial countries would participate in trade, leading to similar entitlement prices in most countries. Clear and binding targets, whatever the principles from which they are derived, are the necessary condition for efficient international trade in entitlements. How to reach agreement across this large agenda when so many countries with such diverse interests have to be part of the solution, and when each has incentives to do less than its share? The review refers to a possible saving grace within the diabolical problem. Substantial proportions of people in each country with varying strength, but in all countries to a surprising extent, support their own country taking substantial action on climate change in the absence of comprehensive and binding international agreement. There is more support for action on climate change in Australia, for example, than on any of the policy reforms involving major structural change in the economy over the past quarter century. It turns out that the saving grace has had considerable power over the past year, not least in Australia. It's why we've got a multi-party parliamentary committee on climate change. The effort to build an international agreement for effective climate change mitigation began at Rio de Janeiro in 1992. This led to an agreement in Kyoto in 1997 on a set of reductions in emissions in developed and transitional countries in the period to 2012. It was accepted at Rio de Janeiro and Kyoto that developing countries would join the mitigation effort with strong commitments once progress had been demonstrated by developed countries. Developed countries were to provide developing countries with funding for application of low emissions technologies and for adaptation to the effects of climate change. Developing countries were to contribute to the global mitigation effort within a framework of differentiated treatment. The Conference of the Parties within the UNFCCC met in Bali in 2007 to define a way towards a follow-on to Kyoto on mitigation and related issues. This would be preparatory to the meeting in Copenhagen in 2009, which it was hoped would define a mitigation agreement for the period after the conclusion of the expiry of the Kyoto commitments at the end of 2012. The approach to international agreement developed by the UNFCCC covered many of the matters that would have to be part of an effective global agreement. However, the Rio-Kyoto-Bali approach to mitigation was overwhelmed by two developments. First, developed countries were slow to implement the commitments that they had made to constrain emissions, and two of them, the United States and Australia, announced in 2001 that they would not ratify the agreement to which they had been parties in Kyoto. Second, the large developing countries entered a period of stronger growth in the early 21st century, the period that I have called the Platinum Age, in which the higher growth was much more energy intensive and energy much more emissions intensive than had been unreasonably anticipated in the 1990s. It was a contribution of the review to the international discussion to highlight these awful realities of the Platinum Age. There were two corollaries for climate policy. First, the global emissions budget, defined by a strong mitigation objective, would require far larger reductions in emissions in all developed countries than had previously been anticipated. For example, for the 450 parts per million objective, a reduction of around 90% in developed countries, when up until fairly recently people have been talking comfortably about a 60% reduction by 2050. A second corollary was that because about 90% of emissions growth under business as usual to 2030 would come from developing countries, it would not be possible to achieve strong mitigation objectives, whatever developed countries might do, unless there were an almost immediate slowing of emissions growth in China, below business as usual, followed before too long by slowing in other large developing countries. Professor Pan, I'm sorry that the reality is so awful, but that is the arithmetic of the problem. So the international community had added a new layer of difficulty to what was already a diabolical policy problem. The difficulty was that it agreed, with the developed countries central to the agreement, that developing countries would not be required to make binding commitments to emissions constraints for a period after the expiry of the Kyoto commitments at the end of 2012. This contradicted the fundamental arithmetic of the problem. The new layer of complexity was in itself enough to make it inevitable that the Copenhagen meeting of the UNFCCC would fail to reach a binding international agreement that it could achieve strong mitigation outcomes. I will come back to Copenhagen, but first it would be useful to say something about the wider context of international relations 1 decade into the Platinum Age and in the aftermath of the great crash of 2008. The Rio and Kyoto conferences had been convened during the world's brief unipolar moment. The collapse of the Soviet Union had placed the political ideologies, the institutions and the power of the developed capitalist democracies, first of all the United States, in an overwhelmingly dominant position. Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man was a bestseller in the United States and influential everywhere. It was possible for the Rio-Kyoto climate change regime to embody the conceptual framework of a self-confident developed world, while accommodating generously the perceptions and expressed interests of major developed countries. The Platinum Age of accelerated growth in the large developing countries changed the context of all international relations. Large differentials in growth rates were shifting global economic weight towards the developing and away from the established developed countries. With the passing of time, this was bound to be associated with a shift in strategic weight towards the large developing countries, first of all China. Sooner or later, these developments would bring to an end the world's unipolar moment and put in its place an international regime within which the United States and the European Union shared global leadership with at least China and India. The Platinum Age would take us into a world in which none of the big international issues will be settled, until at least China and India, as well as the United States and the European Union, accepted the terms of settlement. Sooner or later became sooner with the great crash of 2008. The great crash left a legacy in the United States and Western Europe of greatly diminished growth prospects for a long way into the future. It hardly affected at all the growth trajectories of China and other large developing countries. It accelerated the shift of economic and strategic weight to China and the large developing countries. Internal developments in China are contributing to the acceleration in the rate of change in the global economic and strategic balance. In the years immediately preceding the Great Crash, from about 2004, there were indications that China had entered the turning point in economic development. The absolute increase in demand for labour had been rising each year, while the annual addition to the labour force was falling. Labour was becoming increasingly scarce and real wages were beginning to rise strongly. Resources were moving out of simple labour-intensive into increasingly technologically complex and capital-intensive production. Usually buy my clothes in Beijing. I'm there a few times a year. Last time I was in Beijing 2 weeks ago, I bought a jumper and a few shirts. When I got home, I saw that the shirts were made in Bangladesh and the jumper was made in Cambodia. From 2005 to 2008, the real exchange rate appreciation associated with the increase in real wages caused the international purchasing power of Chinese relative to United States output to rise about twice as rapidly as the differences in national growth rates would suggest. The acceleration of China's catching up with the United States was briefly interrupted by the Great Crash. From October 2008 until sometime in the first quarter of 2009, less than 6 months, Chinese industrial production and trade fell more sharply than in most developed countries. The short-term chapter growth was brought quickly to an end by a huge fiscal and monetary expansion, the largest Keynesian response to recessionary pressures ever to be applied in any country. By the middle of 2009, output was expanding at pre-crash rates. Since then, China has been back on a trajectory of sustained rapid economic growth, rising real wages and structural change to reflect the intensifying scarcity of labour. Been back on a track of Chinese international purchasing power, catching up relative to the United States' internal international purchasing power at around twice the rate that would be expected from differentials in output growth. Chinese relative to United States production value, both valued at international purchasing power, is doubling about every 4 years. The Chinese story of growth and structural change and its quick resumption after the Great Crash is the most powerful and influential in the developing world. But the story of well-established rapid economic growth based on deepening integration into international markets, briefly interrupted during but quickly restored after the Great Crash, is present in other large developing countries. It is present in the next most populous after China of the developing countries, India and Indonesia. The Great Crash has accelerated movement from a global economy and polity dominated by the old developed world, especially the United States, to a multipolar world. This affects every important area of international relations in which cooperation amongst states is required. It affects international negotiations to promote more liberal trade and to constrain nuclear arms proliferation. It affects climate change. The Copenhagen Conference of the Parties within the Framework Convention on Climate Change was an early major test of the world's capacity to manage international affairs within the changing distribution of global economic and strategic weight. The shift in economic and strategic weight after the Great Crash has been occurring more rapidly than our capacity to think through its implications for the system of relations between states and to develop the new ideas and to implement the institutional reforms that are necessary to allow international relations to work within the new power realities. The emerging international system will only work if major decisions on international cooperation are made with the support of the new great powers as well as the old. On economic matters, the new power realities have been institutionalized through the financial crisis and its aftermath by the G20 supplanting the G8 as the primary locus of discussion of international cooperation. The world is still groping towards workable arrangements in other spheres. Copenhagen was part of the groping. The Copenhagen Conference of the Parties was a diplomatic fiasco. On substance, it failed in what had once been seen as its main objective, to develop a binding agreement on a clearly defined set of commitments to mitigation. It was clear from early 2009 that such an agreement was beyond reach, although the failure of participants in the conference to express that reality when it first emerged contributed to salvaging a sort of outcome that nevertheless has value. The Copenhagen Conference built a strong objective into the Copenhagen Accord, to hold likely temperature increases to 2 degrees centigrade, but there was no agreement on how this necessary but demanding target could be reached. China and the other large developing countries resisted any suggestion that they should enter a binding agreement. In this, they were simply standing by what had been agreed in earlier United Nations meetings. While China's rejection of a binding commitment was within the letter of previous agreements on the matter, the continued expectation that they need not go further made it impossible to secure binding commitments from some developed countries, notably the United States. In any case, it was not certain that the United States administration would be in a position to enact the proposals necessary to implement a strong emissions reduction commitment should its hand be called by China and other developing countries. In this sense, the stalemate over binding commitments suited the domestic policy circumstances of the United States. The Copenhagen Accord suited the political circumstances of both the United States and the large developing countries, and would not have been reached if it had not done so. Within the wider fiasco, the Accord's emergence required a high order of diplomatic dexterity in which the President of the United States played a leading role. The absence of clearly defined binding targets with reliable mechanisms for monitoring and measuring performance against them ruled out economically and environmentally efficient international trade in entitlements. For some countries, this constrained the ambition of the target to which they were prepared to commit themselves. The potential for an effective binding and comprehensive mitigation agreement at Copenhagen had been removed when none of the preparations for the conference included the development by at least a subgroup of members of a draft framework of principles for defining how the emissions budget implicit in the mitigation objective should be allocated amongst countries. The review had stressed the central importance of agreement on principles for allocating entitlements. It defined a set of principles, a modification of the widely discussed contraction and convergence approach that had been advocated since the early 1990s by the Institute of the Global Commons in the United Kingdom, which was judged to have some chance of widespread international acceptance and which could deliver a global set of entitlements that added up to the required global budget. To honour the approach that had already been accepted within the UNFCCC, developing countries would accept one-sided targets where there were incentives for compliance but no penalties for failure to comply. The exception was China. There was no possibility of the world achieving strong mitigation objectives unless China made substantial reductions in emissions below business as usual. The modified contraction and convergence approach of the review, allowing for an emissions intensity target to a transitional period for rapidly growing developing countries, was discussed seriously in a number of developing countries, including China. Its focus on per capita emissions, at least, was attractive to the business community of Australia, with our expectations of growing population through immigration. However, neither the approach of the review nor any alternative became the subject of negotiations among states prior to Copenhagen. This was a sufficient condition for failure to achieve an effective binding agreement directed at a strong mitigation objective. This system is overdetermined. There were quite a few sufficient conditions for failure. So there were several sufficient conditions for the failure of the top-down approach at Copenhagen. But Copenhagen was as much the beginning as the end of history. It now seems that the Copenhagen Conference developed a new framework for international cooperation on mitigation that took account of the new global power realities and which may support progress for a time towards effective global mitigation. It embodies a strong mitigation objective to hold likely warming to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It embodies a bottoms-up approach to mitigations. Sorry, Owen, from the session this morning. Each country defines a target for itself, involving an absolute reduction in developed countries and a range of forms of commitment in developing countries, with reductions in emissions intensity and production prominent in the largest of them. There are side payments to encourage developing country conservation of natural forests and to fund some applications of new technologies and adaptation to climate change. There are partially formed mechanisms for monitoring and measuring performance against commitments. Therefore, has taken forward discussion of many of the important elements of an effective binding international agreement. The absence of binding targets limits the scope for economically and environmentally efficient trade in entitlements. The sum of the national entitlements to 2020 falls a long way short of the reductions that would put the world on an economically efficient path to 450 parts per million. And yet the commitments now annexed to the Copenhagen Accord would, if implemented, move the world a long way from business as usual, rather more than the Kyoto Agreement would have. They keep open the possibility of strong mitigation objectives being achieved if these early commitments are met and are followed by the strengthening of commitments over time. They achieved this result mainly because of the strength of commitments of the large developing countries led by China. Together, the commitments of developing countries would take emissions as far below business as usual as would have been required within the review's notional allocations of entitlements. The early signs are that the major developing countries are serious in meeting announced commitments. There is some confusion in some developed countries about the extent to which China's commitment to reduce the emissions intensity of production by 40 to 45% from 2000 levels by 2020 represents departure from business as usual. The confusion derives from the absence of analytic rigour in assessing business as usual. Here the review's rigorous assessments of the sources of China's anticipated growth, the energy intensity of that growth and the emissions intensity of energy provide firmer ground for assessing departures due to Chinese policy than earlier assessments of several international agencies. The latter, still influential after they've been overtaken by events, amongst other things failed to take account of the once-for-all nature of large reductions in intensity in China in the 1990s as market exchange replaced central planning in the allocation of energy inputs in many industries. The developed countries' commitments within the Copenhagen Accord have not gone so far towards meeting the required contributions to strong mitigation. The three developed countries which start with the highest per capita emissions, Australia, and even more so the United States and Canada, stand out for the modesty of their unconditional commitments. The Copenhagen Accord contains no general commitment to minimum levels of investment in innovation in low emissions technologies and industries. Nevertheless, there's been a marked increase in investment in these areas, partly in the context of the stimulus packages for recovery from the Great Crash. It has been significant in China, the United States, Korea and elsewhere, and we've discussed some of those this morning and we'll discuss some this afternoon. Most importantly for the prospects for strong mitigation, the large increase in investment in low emissions processes in China across the range of technologies including nuclear, wind and solar electricity and low emissions motor vehicles has generated sharp reductions in costs. Economies of scale and learning by doing on a large scale have both contributed to cost reductions. As a result, the relative cost of low emissions energy has been falling not only in China, but in all of the countries to which China is now a competitive supplier. So the Copenhagen Agreement on a strong mitigation objective does not appear as isolated from reality as it did in the immediate aftermath of the Conference of the Parties. Nevertheless, current levels of ambition fall far short of the requirements. They can be strengthened over time within the current bottom-up framework by rigorous comparisons of relative effort and the resulting peer pressure and, given the saving grace of community support for action, internal political pressure for laggards to strengthen mitigation performance. Measures of comparative mitigation performance will become important in the dynamics of international mitigation policy. Absolute reductions in emissions from a base year in developed and reductions in emissions intensity in developing countries are emerging as the central basis for comparisons of effort. External verification of measurement of performance would strengthen the tendency for peer and domestic political pressure to raise the level of ambition in mitigation over time. An agreed principle framework for allocating entitlements and verifying performance against them will be necessary for securing wide international support through a long period of larger and more costly global emissions reductions. The modified contraction and convergence of the review could still provide a starting point for exploration of principled approaches to allocating a global emissions budget. The breathing space provided by the Copenhagen Accord provides an opportunity for official exploration of modified contraction and convergence and alternative principled approaches to allocating a limited global emissions budget. Comparisons will also be made of implicit carbon prices as a measure of mitigation effort. Implicit carbon prices have a number of drawbacks as a measure of comparative effort. They are subject to distortion to the extent that a carbon price is accompanied by other measures that diminish pressure to reduce emissions. Measures of the implicit carbon price would need to take account of the negative price implicit in subsidies for use of fossil fuels. In this context, recent media reports that the New South Wales government is considering allocation of coal to electricity generators on the condition that the coal is not sold on the open market are of note and concern. The implicit subsidy to coal-based generation within these arrangements could work against a carbon price and be much larger than the highest carbon price that has been suggested in the Australian policy discussion. The implicit carbon price would need to include the costs of regulatory interventions. These are difficult to measure. Regulatory measures that effectively prevent the establishment of new coal-based power generation in some countries have a carbon price equivalent that is the difference in cost between coal-based and the next lowest cost source of electricity. Measurement of the implicit carbon price requires assessment of costs of the likely alternatives. The implicit carbon price is a measure of the cost burden imposed on users of emissions-intensive products and not of mitigation effects. A country that achieves a given degree of mitigation inefficiently will be credited more highly than one which adopts efficient policies to achieve the same results. This is regrettable if the purpose of the comparisons is to improve the environment for reductions in emissions. But if the purpose is to compare the burdens imposed on firms operating in different countries, this is not inappropriate. There are therefore obvious difficulties with the measures of comparative mitigation effort that have been discussed so far. The difficulties highlight the importance of international agreement on principles for allocating a global emissions budget amongst countries. The Copenhagen bottom-up approach cannot carry as heavy a load as a principled or top-down basis of allocating entitlements would have done. Agreement on a set of principles for allocating emissions entitlements would take time and effort to negotiate. That is why it did not happen in the lead-up to Copenhagen and will not happen soon. But it would still have many advantages. If it were supported by agreed mechanisms for measurement and monitoring, it would allow authoritative comparisons of mitigation performance against a reasonable assessment of whether individual countries were making proportionate contributions to the global effort. Such an agreement would be the basis for setting binding emissions constraints for all substantial economies. This in turn would allow economically and environmentally efficient trade in emissions entitlements. Under any of the bases of comparisons of mitigation effort, Australia will be under pressure to go further than the unconditional target presented under the Copenhagen Accord. Australia's exceptionally high per capita emissions and high population growth both argue for Australia to seek a principal basis for allocating an emissions budget amongst countries. A binding agreement on emissions constraints extending to all substantial economies, with entitlements allocated according to clear principles and with support for strong participation from poorer developing countries, continues to have large advantages, despite the difficulties of and long path to agreement. We now know that the failure to achieve such an agreement at Copenhagen and to reach a more limited agreement around different principles was not fatal to strong global mitigation objectives. It turns out the momentum developed within the new international power relations of the Platinum Age has delivered an outcome that can get us by for the time being. That gives us time to allow new institutions and international political culture to develop around the new power relations, to the point where they can develop the economically and environmentally efficient regime that we will need to avoid dangerous climate change. It's important that the international community continues to make as much progress as it can within the new policy framework from Copenhagen, while using the time that has been created by the Copenhagen Accord to do the work that will move us towards a later comprehensive agreement, a binding agreement that adds up to delivery of the ambitious mitigation objective that has now been agreed. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ross. It's always good to be reminded that climate change mitigation issues do take place in the context of even grander themes. I'm sure you're ready for some tough questions from the audience. We'll take 15 minutes or so for discussion now, and we'll also be asking you to join our panel when we discuss developments in India, Indonesia, and Japan. We'll take questions in twos or threes, and if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself for the audience. Hom, I've got first, and up here.
I'm Hom from EWE, yes. I would like to try to get some synergy from your presentation and Commission plan on how to change the game. My understanding of that plan is that the world will agree on a carbon budget for a century. And then there was a problem on how to distribute that budget to countries. And you had this modified contraction and convergence rule, which would be able to distribute that to countries. Now the difference between your probably position, if I have understood correctly, is that you don't have a necessary commitment for 100-year-long carbon budgets, as this similar plan would require. I would be interested to hear your comments, whether you would like to take that sort of view that the world should go for a 100-year-long carbon budget. Thank you.
And we'll take the second question as well.
My name is Rodrigo Salles. I'm a UNSW PhD candidate. Professor, just first, congratulations for the review. And I kind of ask a clarification. My sense, I'm not an economist. When I read the review analysis and other economic discussions around climate change, it seems that on the per capita emissions issue, most of the analysis on volume and the impact of each country is more related to the intensity of emissions from production other than the consumption. So it seems that the analysis does not challenge as much as it is on production ways the lifestyle of some countries and the principle of ever-growing economy that's driving most of the economy. I'd like you please to clarify this. Thank you.
Just take those two words.
Okay, first, my friend Holmes' point about asking me to clarify the differences between the review's approach and Matsuyoshis plan. I think the biggest difference is that Matsuyoshi did duck the big issue, the hard one, how you allocate entitlements amongst countries. And we tried to come to grips with that. We were talking about a period out to 2050, by which time you'd have per capita emissions down close to the absorptive capacity of the Earth life systems. If you go that far, then and if you've defined an emissions budget over that period, and you've got principles for allocating it over that period, which we had in the review, then I think you've solved the main issue. From then on, you just maintain the very low per capita entitlements, and whether you auction them year by year or sell them all at once is a question of capacity of financial markets, expectations of efficiency and foresight in financial markets, and some related issues. So I don't think that is a big distinction. I think the issue that's raised by our friend from the University of New South Wales is a fundamental one. Should we be seeking not only to solve the climate problem, but also to force a change in the lifestyle of the developed countries? As I look at the problem, and I inevitably embody the accumulated wisdom of having read far too many economics books over a lifetime. But as I see the problem, if you've got an unambiguous way of allocating entitlements to emit, which are widely recognized as being fair, if people in some countries think that they can easily economize on use of permits, if someone in a poor country, in Chad, decides that she can easily do without part of her entitlement and wishes to get money from that, which has high value because she's poor, and someone in a rich country wishes to use part of her wealth to drive a car, when most people in the world have given up driving a petrol-run car, then that is welfare enhancing. The poor person in Chad and the rich person in Japan are both better off as a result of the trade. And there's another way in which the trade would raise welfare. There will be some parts of the world that are suited to certain types of inevitably carbon-intensive production. For example, we don't yet have technologies to make cement without emitting carbon dioxide as you transform carbonates. Now, we may develop cement substitutes that have that effect, but at the moment, you've got to use a lot of cement. You may be a country that has huge advantages in production of cement. If you are allowed to have trade in entitlements, then that country will buy entitlements and keep producing cement. It will sell cement to everywhere that wants it. That won't increase global emissions. It will just mean the cement's made where it's cheapest. And that's a benefit to the people who buy cheap cement and the people who keep their jobs in the country that's good at making cement. So again, it's welfare enhancing in both countries. So I think we need to focus on the real problem. And if the problem is reduction in emissions, there's an advantage in doing it in the cheapest possible way. The allocation of entitlements has to be fair, that we won't have a global system that delivers a strong outcome unless it's seen as being fair. In my discussions in the course of the review in India and Indonesia and China and elsewhere, I became 100% convinced that there was no basis that was going to be widely accepted as being fair unless it was moving. It was ultimately based on equal per capita entitlements. But if that's the basis of allocating entitlements, then trade in entitlements should be welfare increasing for everyone.
We've got 3 questions. We'll start with Professor Pan, then move on to Iman Habib and the gentleman in the black suit.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. We learned a lot. And I've got 2 questions. One is that you mentioned the welfare improvement through trading. And if we talk about mitigation, reduction of emissions, at the margin, I think that the higher emitters, at the margin, if they reduce 1 pound of emission, the cost of the welfare loss would be much lower than the 1 per capita emission. Is very small. For instance, in India, per capita emission is 1.5 pounds. If they reduce 1 pound per capita, they would reduce some 7%. And then in the United States or Australia, if you reduce 1 pound of emission from current 20 pounds per capita, that's somewhat marginal. The welfare loss will be much lower. So in this sense, I think that you may agree with me that the per capita high emission countries might do it even more than the developing countries. So this is from the welfare point of view. The second question is about the actions. Currently, we look at the actions seem to be at a bottom-up approach, and the EU they have 20 to 30% range, and they could do 30, but they just do 20. And Australia, you can do 20 up to 25, but you only do some 5. I suppose if you do something like the Chinese, just do it voluntarily at its maximum, because the Chinese, 40 to 45% is at its maximum already, without any conditions, and then that would give a very example for the developing world to encourage them to do more. Because if you can do 25 and you only do 5, and then this would give a very bad signal to the developing world. So I was asking whether, if Australia would be able to do 25 unilaterally.
Just take it straight away.
Okay, well thanks Professor Panwell. I know you understand the modified contraction and convergence formula that I suggested, because you've commented on that in the past, and I agree 100% that it would not be fair, it would not be good for global welfare to take 1 tonne of the emissions entitlements of everyone. So Australia comes down from 27 to 26 tonnes, and India goes from 1.5 to half a tonne. Yeah, you're quite right, that would not be fair, and that's why I took the view that the only likely basis for an international agreement is one that ends up having equal per capita entitlements. Can't get there overnight, but you can move there over time. I think your point was actually supporting the point there, that we can't compare, there would be no fairness in taking the current starting points and then requiring everyone to reduce by a similar amount. We're going to have to move over time towards a different basis of entitlements. On the question of conditional and unconditional targets, well, there is actually a logic, I think, in countries having conditional and unconditional targets, so that they are prepared to do more in the context of an international agreement. Because in the context of international agreement, or in the context of comparable effort from other countries, the cost of emissions, the cost of reducing emissions is lower, and so the country can afford to go further. I would argue that there is a logic in having conditional and unconditional targets. I'd say that it is better for international cooperation, for the chance of progress, to have your targets unconditional, and that's what China's done, so I'm happy to pat China on the back for that point. But I would defend the logic of being prepared to go further if the world is going further. Will Australia be prepared to go to 25%? Well, our government said that was their conditional target if the rest of the world was doing a lot. What Frank and I have been saying is that we should actually look at what other countries are doing, and on a fair basis do what we said we'd do, and go further than 5% in the context of substantial international action. So I hope that Australians will be comfortable about measuring what other countries are doing and making sure they make a proportionate effort.
Okay, we will need to take a break in the Q&A now, because Cleo tells me that New Delhi is calling, and we want to make sure that we don't lose the video link, because they've already been waiting for 10 minutes. So I'll get back to you with the questions, and I'll ask you to just hold those questions until we get to discussion time after the papers, if that's all right. So technology will